That smell, a reminiscent, scorching miasma diffused across no man's land, spread thin and leaving only the musty aroma playing on the minds of young men. We were left to ponder if it was just a non-lethal odour, or a threat of a new, deadly gas encroaching on the trench that we called home. The weaponised gas only made our morality ease with the murder of our enemies, as everyone, on both sides, wore gas masks. We didn't have to look into the eyes of our foes, we stole the life from their soul, made our murders less tragic, and made me into the trained killer that I am today. The taint of death polluted the water beneath our feet, shallow puddles of never-ending darkness that soaked rot into our toes and heels. The flesh turned white and peeled away, and many left their ability to march on in the trenches. It was the spring of 1917. There was a little heat and a brisk wind. It was quiet for a while, but we knew all too well that daunting silence wouldn't last. We dreaded the order to send us over the top, to blindly and bravely rush into battle as a united squadron, knowing that many of us will never return to greet the dirty faces of their fellow chums. My only memories were hazy. I was running, gun in hand, into blazing combat before everything went a blank. The last thing I can remember is the skin burning from my back and the horrible explosions in no man's land. I was just in France. I was 18, and the war was still on. Suddenly it was January of 1919, and it's freezing as last year's winter sees its way out. After I was hit and knocked out, I was taken to the first aid tent on the front line of the Somme back in France, and they moved me back to London after we'd won the war. I have a faint memory of being in a coffin and being surrounded by sand. I heard rumours. Terrible rumours. I didn't believe them. I never thought they would fit a man for his coffin while he still had his breath. Every moment I spend in a confined space drags me back to the terrifying memories of those months I spent trapped in that tiny box. I was 19 years old, and I had lost a massive chunk of time. I awoke in a hospital back home. To my confusion and despair, the doctors tried to explain the events of the last 9 months. Britain and her allies had won the war. The Spanish influenza paraded across Europe in a war of its own, a seemingly stronger opponent than the Jerrys. They tried to explain the treaty to me, the Treaty of the Versailles. If I recall correctly, they bombarded me with all this new information, and they told me the heartbreaking news of my parents' death in a violent conflict with the invaders. For years, I was nothing but a warrior, a trained, ruthless killer. But there was nothing to fight for. No cause binding me to my duty, no release for my inner soldier. I had wounds that were so severe I had to be sedated for months to allow them to heal as the best they could without leaving me in a coma. I have lived out the last few decades as an average Great War vet. I was married, with a family, manager of a local shop, and lived a low-key life with a little excitement and modest interactions with the locals. Then came the turn of the Second World War. It wasn't a shock to anyone. In fact, it was the inevitable consequence for Europe after the Nazis invaded Poland. I enlisted straight away. It called to me as a child of war, called me to follow my father into battle and defend my country with bravery and honour. Though sad, my family understood that it was my true calling, and that my country needed me more than they ever did. I wrote to my dear wife, Mavis, and our 2 beloved children often. Eventually, I heard they were evacuated to the countryside, for safety from the Blitz of London. It must have been something in the stars that day. Everything around me felt wrong. Nothing seemed to be going right for our troops. Our trench was flooded above the normal level. Our orders were confusing and distorted as they passed down the chain of command. To be brutally honest with myself, I believe our sergeant didn't want us to accept the order to go over the top this time. After seeing so many young men die, I don't think his morality would have let him send anyone else into the cold clasp of death, filled with barbed wire and piled corpses, never to be identified. After we finally got a clear order to wage out the battle along the Krauts, we were revved to the point that we felt like we could win the war on our own. We felt convinced that we could sprint across the battlefield into the enemy trench and take out the whole regiment of those Nazi scum, then march forward triumphantly to win this war against Hitler and his evil Aryan race. The enthusiasm was short-lived. Once we had climbed up to fight our enemy, they anticipated our tactics. A spy was possibly in our midst, giving them the heads up, but it was not our concern. That was HQ's issue. Ours was to kill or be killed. I killed, and I was killed. So I and many others fought anyway. It was a bullet. A bullet pierced my heart, physically and emotionally, crippling my very existence, snagging me between life and death, unable to move, unable to die. I lay upon the cold, muddy field for days on end. The only thing I could do was think. My consciousness was there, but my body wasn't. All I could do was hope that someone would find me and save me. I didn't understand what was happening to me, how I could have looked into the blank mask of my enemy as he shot me dead, and still have thoughts running through my head sometime afterward. Was it possible that I wasn't sedated back in the Great War, but merely unconscious for all that time while my body healed? Could I heal the hole in my heart if I stayed there long enough? If I stayed there too long, there would be nothing left of me. I'd just be another rotting corpse, decaying alone in this hell. I eventually got some feeling back after about a week of lying silently still. I must have had a look of death about me when I climbed back down the ladder into the trench. Not many of my comrades remain though. The ones I befriended in our time here looked at me with an unadulterated horror in their eyes. The horror that accompanies the sight of a dead man walking with a hole in his chest. I baffled every doctor in the hospital who saw me, and there were so many. I just explained what had happened, but they didn't want to believe me. I wasn't in my right mind, so I resigned to the theory of delirium. I didn't really care. I just wanted to be treated and get well again, to return to my family alive. Of course, I was wrong. 6 special doctors were reassigned to work with me. They wanted to verify the truth of my immortality, to test the extent of pain I could withstand. Their methods were excruciating, to say the least. They tried to kill me several times, giving me time to heal between each experiment. They tried everything but blowing my brains out. I think they were going to save that for last. They cut off a finger to see if it would grow back. It didn't. They punctured my lungs and broke my limbs, gave me internal bleeding over and over, starved me for weeks until I looked like a prisoner of war. I didn't see daylight for months. After regaining my strength taken during their last experiment, I managed to break out of the containment unit they had caged me in, and I ran for my life. I found myself in some sort of specialised psychiatric facility with fairly heavy security. By some God forbid miracle, I made it through and I never looked back. I kept on moving, and I made it home to my family by the time the war was over. My wife asked what had happened to me over the year that we lost touch. She never believed that I was dead. She never gave up hope. I told her that I was captured and it was too painful to think about, let alone talk about, and we just left it at that. We lived normally again into our late 50s, but the peace came to an end one day. My darling wife pointed out that I hadn't got any grey hair or crow's feet like she had. She looked so much older and more mature, and my face was as young as the day I returned from the war, more rested and healed, but still young. I couldn't explain it to her. How could I? I didn't even realise it myself. I just joked that I was lucky and maybe I would stay young forever. Secretly, I hoped that's all it was, but came to doubt it very much. Over the next 2 years, she would make sly remarks about my appearance, staying at me romantically, then dropping in with, "You look like my toy boy." Complaining that she had to lie to her friends of why I looked the same in the last 10 years. She thought I was a freak of nature. She knew this wasn't natural. I could try to colour my hair grey, but I couldn't deceive her. I have to leave, to relieve her of the stress of my curse. My immortality must remain a secret. It would kill her if she knew what I was. So, I moved away. Not too far though. I watched them from a distance. Watched her grow old and eventually die. I watched my children grow up and have families. After a few decades it became painful to no longer be part of their lives. I couldn't watch anymore. I couldn't have a life like a normal person. I wanted to be alone and live through my painful, everlasting life like the creator that cursed me with this agony. All I want is death, and death is the only thing that escapes me. I didn't want this, I never asked for it, I just want it to end. I'm a 96-year-old man in a 19-year-old's body. This is wrong, I feel wrong, I am wrong. Every ounce of my existence is immoral, perverse, and rotting on the inside. I am a soul miscalculated by the gods to live an eternal suffering worse than the torments of hell. Lucifer himself would beg for mercy in my plight. After years of floating around the world, keeping my scarred body under wraps and maintaining a low profile the best I could, I found myself on the knees at the door of the Cane Hill Asylum. It was the very same hospital I was locked in all those years ago. It was in the middle of nowhere with no presence of life, just an old building, with everything still inside, derelict and forgotten. There were beds and some canned food. By the expiration dates I estimated that it must have been abandoned in the mid-80s. I made myself a little home there. If there was anywhere in the world I could be left to suffer in solitude, it would be there. My body would not be scarred by explosions or bullets, and the sounds of gunshots wouldn't disturb the landscape for miles. Beautiful countryside surrounded the facility, hills and trees untouched for man by decades. Nature was undisturbed and whole there. I found tranquility in watching the animals pass by the windows and the birds gliding over the top. But with all beauty, I knew, came death. I befriended some of the creatures around my new home. I found a discarded bird's nest with the eggs still unhatched. So I reared the chicks myself. They would return from time to time to sit on the ledge where I fed them. There were a few brave rabbits that would approach me as I lay on the grass. One in particular that survived an attack from a fox or some other kind of predator, and it had a missing leg. I treated it and cared for it until it died a few years later. I longed for companionship, but all I had were animals that would die shortly after we bonded. I longed to hold my wife and see my children, but I knew they were long gone, lost to a dominion no longer meant for me. The pain of loneliness is more than anyone could suffer as I had. To endure everything you know changing and adapting in front of your eyes for longer than any person should. I needed to do something. I couldn't live in limbo any longer. I was always curious of what lay behind the security doors, and I decided that I had to get in. I had an eternity to break through the door after all. When I finally managed to, I found a containment unit with medical stores, row after row of sedatives and anesthetics, needles and scalpels. And I remembered some of the things that were used on me. I decided to perform my own experiments in an attempt to find some manner of escape. If I could find something to put me out for weeks at a time, surely I could tolerate this hell. Since then, I had slept for months to skip past the long days of solitude. But it isn't enough. I don't need a sedative to dim that light of my soul, but rather blot it out forever. I have searched for a miracle over the course of a decade, travelling the world, skipping months at a time, but I still came back around. My efforts were fruitless. Whatever I tried would simply knock me out temporarily, but it would never kill me once and for all. To end this hell would take more than just drugs. Over the years I've had a long time to reminisce over my memories, good and bad. Some give me joy, some I lock away in a place in my mind I do not often visit, and some prove useful in my search for demise. A memory was pushed from my subconscious into my mind from a billboard advertising a new movie telling the tale of a ship destined for the depths. It reminded me of when I first travelled to France on my first World War placement. I found myself spiralling off the side of the ship into the icy waters below. No one was around. It was panic mode aboard, everyone panicking on a possible sighting of the enemy. Most of the troops were sleeping when the ship jolted and I was tossed into the channel. I was one man, one soldier with no acquaintances as of yet. No one even knew I was missing. So when I washed up on the coast of France in my military gear, confusion was amongst the reactions. I told them what voyage I was on, and they told me that I arrived almost a week ago, and I had no memory of the past week in the sea. I couldn't believe it. Until this day, I never thought any more of it. I think I found a way out of this eternal life, to lock myself under the waves in a crypt of unconscious limbo. My plan is to secure an anchor to my legs, and drop my weighted body into the deep water, and sink down to the bottom forever. I know that I am cursed to roam this world for an eternity. I am but a ghostly presence amongst young souls. Now it's time to seal myself in a watery tomb, away from life, away from the world.